In only a few decades, Taiwan has managed to grow into one of the strongest economies in Asia. But it has a wild and controversial history. It's twice been a refuge for the losing side of China's civil wars. There was a time in the 1600s when it was filled with pirates and headhunting tribes targeting colonists. There were political systems that were so corrupt they had a specific name created for them. Let me tell you about the creepiest things that were normal in Taiwan. The mid-17th century was a turbulent time in China. The Ming Dynasty, which had ruled for the previous 300 years, was on its way out. Replacing it was the Qing Dynasty, which would rule into the early 20th century. Now, caught up in all this change was the son of a pirate and a Ming loyalist who didn't like the transition at all. Zheng Chenggong, also known as Kashinga, was born to a Chinese pirate/merchant father and a Japanese mother. He was a marauding pirate, but Kashinga was also educated in the Confucian classics and deeply loyal to the Ming Dynasty. Skill-wise, great military leader, smart strategist, and for many people in the region at the time, he was like the poster guy of resistance against the Qing Dynasty. After the fall of the Ming Dynasty in 1644, Kashinga became one of the most well-known Ming loyalists around. He commanded like 300 to 400 ships that would run rampant along the South China coast, stacking up W's against the Qing. In 1661, Kashinga led a military expedition to Taiwan, which was then under Dutch colonial rule. He came for Fort Zeelandia, which the Dutch built a few decades earlier, eventually defeated them and established the Kingdom of Tongninh. The campaign is said to have been brutal. Afterwards, Kashinga and his allies got their revenge on the Dutch. A lot of his allies were Aboriginal tribes who had been living on the island for far longer than both the Dutch or the Chinese. They had defected from the Dutch side over to Kashinga's side. Kashinga offered amnesty to a few of these tribes, including the Sinjan, who then went about hunting down Dutch stragglers and beheading them. They also piled up and burned the Christian textbooks that the Dutch were forcing the Aboriginal populations to study. But Kashinga died suddenly just months after the victory. Now, his death was kind of shady. Some people say he died of malaria, others say he lost his mind when he found out his son had an affair with his wet nurse. Now, if you don't know, a wet nurse is a woman that breastfeeds and cares for another's child. In any event, his son and successor to the newly formed Kingdom of Tongninh, Zheng Jing, wasn't as kind to the Aboriginal tribes as his father was. After the victory of the Dutch, tens of thousands of Zheng loyalists piled onto the island, and there wasn't enough food for all of them. Zheng Jing set up an intensive agricultural program, executing any natives who didn't want to participate. Talk about incentive. This led to quite a few beefs between the newly arrived Han Chinese and the indigenous populations, most of which didn't go well for the tribes. It looked like they had traded one colonizer for another. The Kingdom of Tongninh wouldn't last for very long. Just 22 years after it was founded, the Qing Dynasty came in and defeated the remaining Ming loyalists. I talked about it some, but let's get a little more into the habit of some of the Taiwanese indigenous tribes' love for removing the heads of their enemies. Headhunting was a common practice with many Taiwanese Aboriginal tribes, particularly the ones who lived in the mountainous regions of Taiwan's east coast. Nearly all groups except the isolated Yamei and Ivatan people had traditions of headhunting raids and rituals. The targets of tribal headhunting were often competing Plains tribes, Han Chinese settlers, and eventually Japanese settlers who started colonizing the island towards the end of the 1800s. Mountain tribes saw them all as enemies. There were a lot of headhunting raids that aimed to kill farmers and workers laboring in the fields. The tribes would set fire to buildings and then behead those trying to get away from the fire. You were damned if you did and damned if you didn't. The warriors behind this would take the heads after battles or raids as prized trophies or ceremonial offerings to the tribe. The Taiwanese Aboriginal people continued to practice headhunting throughout the transition from Dutch colonial rule to Chinese control under Kashinga to formal Japanese colonization that kicked off in the late 19th century. Life for the tribes was really nasty under the Japanese. Japanese authorities tried to brutally suppress and finally abolish the custom through aggressive military campaigns against the Taiwanese natives. Over the course of Japan's occupation of Taiwan, and that went from about 1895 to 1945, there was uprising after uprising by the indigenous populations against the Japanese. One of the worst and most violent was in Wusha, a Japanese settlement outside modern-day Taichung. In October 1930, members of the Seediq tribe exacted revenge for years of Japanese oppression by doing something horrible. They attacked people during an athletic event, indiscriminately taking the lives and heads of 134 Japanese people who were there. The Japanese responded by sending 2,000 troops into Wuxia, forcing the Seedic people into the mountains. The Japanese then let it rain in the mountains, reportedly using mustard gas devices. Now, that was one of the first cases of modern chemical warfare in Asia. After it was done, over 644 Seedic had died. Tragedy for both sides. Japan's notorious kamikaze pilots were one of the most terrifying aspects of World War II's Pacific theater. Kamikaze pilots flew strapped with tons of high-powered explosives. They sank somewhere between 47 and 57 U.S. warships, and they damaged many others as part of Japan's last-ditch effort to salvage victory in a war that it was clearly losing. And since Taiwan was under Japanese control during the war, the island ended up being one of the largest training sites for kamikaze pilots. And you're probably thinking, why would a kamikaze pilot need training? In 1944, the Japanese military set up several kamikaze training bases in Taiwan because of its proximity to Okinawa and the Philippines, which were key battlegrounds in the Pacific theater. These young pilots, a lot of them were teenagers. They went through intensive training in rudimentary aircraft operation and kamikaze tactics. Now, the training courses only went about 2 weeks. Fun fact here, though, the training didn't include how to safely land a plane. Duh! In Beitou, just north of Taipei, there was a hot spring resort called Kazana Hotel. This is where the new trainees would have their last meals and soak in the mineral-rich waters of the hot spring before being shipped out for their final missions. It was a sober time, but one a lot of these young soldiers had willingly signed up for, whether they were drunk on nationalism or filled with the idea that their emperor was God and they would do whatever it took to help Japan succeed in the war. There's an archive of letters they sent to family and loved ones that would break your heart. Check this one out, where one pilot addresses his infant child. "Even if I die without you knowing me, you must not grieve. When you get older and want to see me, come to Kudan and pray with all your heart, and my face will appear before you." Over 2,400 Japanese kamikaze pilots died over the year the program was active. It was tragic. Not long after World War II ended, Japan was kicked out of Taiwan. The island then came under the administration of the Republic of China, led by Chiang Kai-shek and his Kuomintang Party, or KMT. China had been in the midst of a civil war since the late 20s, and by 1949, Kai-shek's party had been defeated by Mao Zedong and his Communist Party. As a result, Kai-shek and the defeated KMT loyalists fled to Taiwan, kind of like what happened with Kashinga and his Ming loyalists after their defeat to the Qing 300 years earlier. Kai-shek and the KMT, with support from allied forces like the U.S., who saw him as an important part of their new anti-communist strategy, quickly turned Taiwan into an atmosphere of suffocating authoritarianism. Things took a turn for the worse before Chiang Kai-shek and the KMT had even officially lost the Civil War. 2 years before Mao and his Communist Party were victorious, there was an event that led to one of the most brutal crackdowns in the island's history. It is known as the February 28th incident. On February 27, 1947, an altercation between Taiwanese civilians and Chinese government agents in Taipei sparked widespread protests against Chinese rule. Troops, they fired into protesting crowds, killing some civilians, and an island-wide uprising took off. Taiwanese civilians took control of towns and cities. They took control of radio stations and broadcast their pleas for help internationally. They formed committees to demand reforms and autonomy from China. The KMT government, led by the newly appointed governor of Taiwan, Chen Yi, couldn't do much about the revolt until March 8th, when reinforcements arrived from mainland China. The troops then launched a brutal crackdown. They killed thousands of Taiwanese civilians to suppress the uprising. They didn't much care who they were, they just killed them. They specifically targeted political leaders and those who had served in administrative roles under Japanese rule. By late March, Chen Yi's forces had imprisoned or executed a lot of Taiwanese leadership and regained control. Afterwards, Chen Yi was fired by Kai-shek and was later sentenced to death by a Taiwanese court for his responsibility in the brutal response. Resentment toward Chinese rule continued to simmer after the incident, and then it got even worse. 2 years later, Taiwan was plunged into a nearly 4-decade period of political suppression and martial law. It was called the White Terror period in Taiwan, which lasted from 1949 to 1987. It was a horror show of political repression and human rights abuses under Chiang Kai-shek and the KMT. During this White Terror, thousands of people were rounded up and either imprisoned indefinitely or executed. A lot of them were intellectuals, social activists, or anyone else suspected of opposing the KMT regime and being a communist. Now, the exact number of victims, we still don't know, but estimates suggest tens of thousands were imprisoned or terminated. Chiang Kai-shek, who again was supported by the U.S. and other Western allies, under martial law, strict censorship was imposed. The KMT controlled all media, and dissent, man, it was put down hard. The so-called Taiwan Garrison Command and the secret police wielded a ton of power during this time. They used a network of informants. We call them snitches, I think, these days. They had eyes and ears everywhere. A lot of people were betrayed by neighbors and colleagues. Even family members sold them out. Trust? What trust? It was pretty much non-existent. Many trials during the White Terror lacked any kind of due process. The accused often had no access to legal representation and were forced to sign confessions during punishments. Trials, if they were even held, were usually closed to the public and very quick. If you didn't get death, you probably got sent to Green Island. The prison on Green Island was horrible. People referred to it as a concentration camp. One of the many prisoners who ended up there was a Taiwan-based Chinese author and activist named Bo Yang. Bo Yang, in 1967, was arrested in Taiwan for translating a Popeye's comic strip that was seen as a parody of Chiang Kai-shek's arrival and authoritarian rule in Taiwan. In the comic, Popeye and Sweet Pea set food in some uninhabited land, and Popeye tells Sweet Pea that she can be a crown prince, and Sweet Pea responds she wants to be president instead. Popeye isn't too happy about this and said, "Why, you little," and then it trailed off. Chiang Kai-shek took offense because he saw this as criticism about his installation of his son as heir apparent in Taiwan after his defeat and retreat from mainland China. But Bo Yang wasn't about to confess to some false charges. He was detained and punished by interrogators trying to force a confession, but he wouldn't confess, and he got 12 years on Green Island. He was finally released in 1977, 2 years after Chiang Kai-shek died. Despite all its political oppression and the climate of fear that hovered over the island for decades, the KMT actually enacted some economic policies that turned the small island into an economic juggernaut. Over the course of just a few decades, Taiwan became one of the strongest economies in all of Asia, earning a spot in the so-called Four Asian Tigers, along with Hong Kong, South Korea, and Singapore. Early land reforms and industrialization, combined with educational reforms and a focus on workforce development, drove economic expansion on the island. Then, in the 1980s, Taiwan started a big push into the tech sector, specifically manufacturing semiconductors, giving it huge export revenues in things like electronics. But it remains to be seen what the future of the island will be. It has a strained relationship with mainland China, made more tenuous by the island's international economic success and its historical tensions with the mainland. Thanks for watching. What else do you want to learn about? We hope you enjoyed this Nutty production. Please like and share the video to support our efforts and subscribe to watch more videos like this one. Thank you.